I mean, it's utterly petulant and pathetic, really, if you think about what Russia has done.
Now, the Sun's defence editor, Jerome Starkey, has been issued with an arrest warrant by Vladimir Putin. Downing Street's condemned the move, calling it desperate rhetoric from the Kremlin. A regional court in the Kursk border region accused Jerome of illegally crossing the border into Russia last year. Well, Jerome Starkey is with us in the studio. Jerome, good morning.
Morning, Rosie.
Just take us back to the reporting that you did back in August last year. We'll remember it. We talked to you at the time, what you found and how difficult it was to gain access.
Well, it was very hard to gain access. You remember Ukraine's armed forces had launched this sort of lightning assault into Kursk province. It was the first time that Russia had lost territory on its own, lost its own sovereign soil, I think, since the Second World War, and a huge reversal of fortunes, big symbolic victory for Ukraine. And so really important, we felt, to try and get into that territory, to see what had happened there as much as we could, to try and speak to anyone who was left behind. And most of the Russian citizens and soldiers had fled. In fact, all the soldiers in the bits we were in had fled because they'd been defeated, they'd been forced to retreat. But there were still a handful of civilians. They were the old and the frail and the poor. They were the ones who couldn't flee for one reason or another. And it was fascinating to talk to them because for 2.5 years they'd been living in this border region right next to Ukraine, where this slaughter had been waged in their name, and yet they were sort of totally indifferent, almost totally unaware, like they didn't seem to know, or certainly didn't seem to really care that there was a war being waged just a few miles away. And I actually found that sense of indifference really chilling, because whilst it was only a tiny vignette, if you imagine that perhaps the experience of those people in Sudzha, the town that I visited in Kursk, was echoed across Russia, then you begin to realise perhaps why there hasn't been any sort of groundswell, any movement against Vladimir Putin for waging what the rest of the world sees as a wanton slaughter in this totally unnecessary war of aggression.
Obviously, your reporting helped clarify and paint a picture of exactly what was happening, that sentiment you talk about. Tell us what happened next, and when you heard from the Kremlin, from Putin, from one of his people who work with him, about the trouble they wanted to put you in.
We were aware before we crossed the border that this sort of response was a risk. I mean, it's utterly petulant and pathetic, really, if you think about what Russia has done. The crime that I'm allegedly guilty of is crossing an international state border without permission. And it begs the question, quite what exactly did the Russians expect me to do? To get my passport, to stop the convoy when the skies are saturated with drones, and get my passport stamped in the embers of the Russian border post, which had been totally destroyed. All the border guards had fled. I mean, there was no possibility of recognising that border. And to all intents and purposes, that border where I crossed no longer existed because, as I say, Ukraine had annexed, or not formally annexed, but had captured for the time being this territory. Important to point out, Ukraine has stated they have no intention of keeping this territory. It's a sort of manoeuvre within a wider strategic conflict. Russia, by threatening journalists with these sorts of repercussions, by issuing an arrest warrant, putting me on an international wanted list, it's just an attempt to threaten me and to threaten other journalists like me who might do this sort of work, to try and make us scared of reporting the truth, to impose costs and penalties and risks for doing our job. Now, I was already banned from Russia. I was never going to go to Russia. I'm not going to go to Belarus or any states that I think are sort of too closely aligned with Russia, because I was sanctioned in the first summer of the war. But this does have some consequences. It does potentially make it more complicated travelling to other countries which might honour a Russian extradition request.
Yeah, because it's going to inevitably have some impact on your reporting, even though the defiance and the determination to keep telling these stories is obviously evident. Obviously, our colleague at the Wall Street Journal, and we remember Evan Gershkovich, detained for 16 months it was in the end. How will this change how you report? And have you got a new sense of nervousness, or did you just think this is inevitable that I was going to receive some kind of response like this?
This will not change how I report. This will not change what I report. It will only change, perhaps, countries that I am able to visit. But I was already banned from Russia. It just means I have to think a little bit more carefully about countries which might be loyal to Russia, those kind of grey zone countries whose allegiances are not quite clear, and whether, were I to transit those airports or visit those countries, I might find myself in trouble with those authorities at the behest of the Kremlin. But certainly, day to day, whilst I'm in London, and more importantly, whilst I'm in Ukraine, I'll continue very much I'm determined to continue reporting as much as we can, as accurately as we can, what is happening in Ukraine.
There couldn't have been more clear support from Number 10 from Downing Street, journalists in the UK, of the importance of your work and how integral it is. I think just broader picture from your perspective in terms of, obviously, everyone is condemning this action from Russia and your arrest. How do you see this developing, and particularly Keir Starmer, the Labour government's support of Ukraine, in terms of what happens next in this conflict? How you imagine your job is going to take shape in the next 6 months, a year, in terms of what happens in this conflict?
I think everybody realises right now how this conflict moves forward all depends on Donald Trump. We can't forget he promised on the election campaign to end the conflict in 24 hours. We've since heard his special envoy to Ukraine say that that's more likely to be 100 days, and there's also suggestions it might not be 100 days, it might be longer than that still, because it's an incredibly complicated problem. The Ukrainians are acutely alive to the fact that Donald Trump wants to end the war, but so do they. It's worth remembering that no one wants this war to last a day longer than it needs to, because of the absolute carnage and misery that it's inflicting on Ukrainian soldiers, on Ukrainian civilians, but of course also on the Russian soldiers who are being thrown to their deaths for this, totally unnecessary conflict. But how it ends is important, because if it ends in a victory for Russia, or at least in a way that Russia can present as a victory, then that emboldens Moscow. And it emboldens other countries which might be considering using force to annex territories which they lay claim to. The obvious example is China and Taiwan. And what we have to also remember is that at whichever point this war ends, Russia will have spent years building up its armed forces. It suffered spectacular losses. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers have been killed and injured. Thousands of tanks and armoured vehicles, aircraft have been destroyed. But the reaction to that is Russia has moved to a full wartime economy. Its factories are churning out munitions. Its recruitment mechanisms are working at full stretch to replenish those soldiers who are being maimed and slain on the front line. So when this conflict ends, what Russia will have is actually an armed forces which is growing in terms of material, in terms of military equipment and ammunition, and it will also have whatever is left of its infantry forces. It will be battle-hardened soldiers who've been tested in war, and that means that Russia will potentially pose a very real threat, likely pose a very real threat to whoever is next on its list.
Jerome, thank you so much. Jerome Starkey, the defence editor of The Sun, who makes the front page here. You won't silence Jerome. And clearly that point's been made clear. Jerome, thank you so much for your time.
Can I just say, Jerome, if committing journalism is a crime, then you are a serious and serial offender. I would just like to say that to you.
Thanks, Canon.
It's really lovely to see you. Thank you very much. That is Jerome Starkey. Who is The Sun's defence editor. We'll catch up with him again soon.